Shall I make a start? Is that most of the people entered? Yeah. Okay, so welcome to everybody to Understanding Your Carbon Footprint. This is one of 3 in the Ambition to Action series that aims to support organisations and businesses to practically reduce their environmental impact. So this is organised by Cambridge Carbon Footprint, or CCF, in partnership with Investors in the Environment, IIE, and with support from Cambridge City Council. The aim is for our attendees to leave these sessions with a better understanding of practical step-by-step processes and tools you can use to make your workplaces and organisations more sustainable. This session is being recorded and will be posted. Post-event, we'll share the slides, the recording and the chat. If you don't want to be on camera, then please just switch your camera off. And please ensure you stay muted unless you're specifically asked to unmute yourself. If you do have Zoom or technology issues, then please let us know if you can via the chat. We'll do what we can to help you. Sometimes turning your video off can help with connectivity issues. So just to introduce myself, I'm Clare. I'm a sustainability consultant with Investors in the Environment. Investors in the Environment work with a variety of different businesses and support them to reduce their environmental impacts through implementing environmental management systems and making their businesses leaner, greener, more efficient, etc. So I've been working with IIE for just over a year now, but I've worked in similar roles and done a lot of various different bits and pieces of work over the course of 10 years, looking at both sustainability of businesses and sustainability of buildings. I also, as well as working for Investors in the Environment, I also am a volunteer, and I volunteer as a trustee for CCF. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about CCF. So CCF raises awareness of the climate crisis and supports people to move to low carbon living. They've been delivering an average of 65 events a year over the last 15 years with the support of thousands of volunteers. They're well known for open eco homes, home energy workshops, being a key partner in the Cambridge Repair Cafe network, and for hosting Cambridge's Sustainable Fashion Festivals. Relatively new work includes the Cambridge Climate Change Charter and Net Zero Now, which is a training course for new climate leaders. So please, I've put a screenshot here of the CCF Cambridge Climate Change Charter. Please do have a think about signing up to it. There's 2 ways you can do so. You can go in as an individual or household on this button, and that will allow you to calculate your household carbon footprint and make specific pledges to reduce that carbon footprint, or you can continue as a business or organisation. There's no carbon footprint functionality as things stand. Hopefully that will be developed in the future. But what you can do is make pledges to reduce your business's environmental impact through fairly broad but important pledges, things like committing to write an environmental policy, calculate your carbon footprint, etc. And CCF will be following up on those that have committed and hopefully creating a nice community of businesses in Cambridge. So the agenda for today, once I've finished welcoming everyone, I'm going to hand over to Simon. I'm going to let Simon introduce himself, but suffice to say he's a real carbon footprinting expert with 17 years of experience. So he's going to be talking about understanding your organisation's carbon footprint. Then we're going to have a question and answer session. The way this is going to work is if you want to ask a question, please ask a question at any time in the chat. And then what will happen is Nicole from CCF is going to be here and she's going to field those questions to Simon and myself. She may well answer some herself if they're related to CCF in the specific question and answer slots. So after the first Q&A session, I'll be talking a little bit about some case studies of SME carbon footprints that I've worked on over the course of the past year. And then we'll have another Q&A session, and perhaps as well we might have a little bit of discussion. We did ask everybody to bring some energy data, so we might have a bit of a discussion about how you found collecting that information, because it can be more difficult than it might initially sound. So if you want to discuss that, feel free. And then at about 2 to 3, I'm going to wrap up. I'm hoping to close reasonably promptly at 3, because I have elsewhere to be, as I'm sure many of you have. So I'm going to hand over to Simon. Simon, thank you so much for being here today. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Hello everyone, and I'm Simon Alsop from Energize, and I'm going to today be running you through how to get an understanding of your carbon footprint as an organization. In terms of today's objectives, really the aim is to explain to you the principles of carbon footprinting, or sometimes known as greenhouse gas reporting, but they are the same thing. How to map your emissions and your operation as a whole, an understanding of how to use that data and gain some insight from it, and just some key things to think about as you go through the journey. So to get started, I'm just going to deal with some of the kind of foundational understanding that sits behind how greenhouse gas reporting is working in the first place. So when we refer to greenhouse gases, we're talking about 6 gases really here in the first place. The vast majority of the time people think about carbon dioxide, but when we're doing the reporting, we're really referring to 6 different gases, the ones that are shown on the screen: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluorides. The diagrams on the screen, the icons, give some indication as to where you might likely find them. So obviously carbon dioxide is a byproduct of combustion. Methane is quite commonly released from waste operations, hence the bin, but it's also quite common in agriculture. Nitrous oxides have, again, an agricultural link, but there's also industrial links there. And then hydrofluorocarbons are pretty common in refrigerants, and then perfluorocarbons and sulfur hexafluorides are more common in manufacturing. Why is all of this particularly relevant in terms of it? Ultimately, you're accounting for them all if you use the carbon dioxide equivalent factor, and we'll get onto that in a second in terms of the next slide. But they all have relative impacts, and you can see in the bottom left corner of this that there is a global warming potential for each of these chemical substances on relative scale to carbon dioxide. So the reason we use carbon dioxide equivalent is that that's kind of almost the lowest impact per unit, but we use it as a scale to allow ourselves to combine them together, and it helps us understand the impact of greenhouse gases as a whole. Carbon dioxide is the one that majority of the focus is on, but we do, in terms of tackling global warming, need to tackle all of them. And so when you're looking at carbon factors, you should generally look at the carbon dioxide equivalent factor, not just the one that says carbon dioxide. So when we're talking about that CO2e, or carbon dioxide equivalent I just mentioned, that becomes our standard unit of measurement, in the same way as you'd measure distance by meters, or you'd measure weight in kilograms. Your measure of kind of your unit is carbon dioxide equivalent, and that can be measured in kilos, grams, kilograms, tons, megatons, gigatons, but it's tons ultimately in most cases. And we use it to be able to provide a single unit of measurement to allow ourselves to use it on a comparable scale, and that can be really important because for some organizations, you really need to get context of where the important part of your carbon footprint is. And it's not that it's not all important, but it's that at this stage in the journey for most organizations, for where we are in relation to climate change, it's really about finding where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of taking action. And so it is really important to make sure that you've got that single unit of measurement and that consistency. So in terms of what that looks like, in terms of how to calculate that, all carbon footprint activity across the board runs under a very common structure, which I generically would refer to as activity times by a carbon factor equals the carbon footprint. So in this case, we've got 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. We've got the carbon factor from the 2019 carbon factors in this case. Basically, that gets you your carbon footprint. And you can see that initially in here, it's expressed as grams, but at the bottom, it's been converted to kilograms and tons. The traditional expression of it, you'd express it in tons. It's the numbers get so large generally that if you don't express it in tons, it kind of becomes a meaninglessly large number. There are occasions where kilograms are appropriate, but grams very rarely. Just as a quick kind of anecdotal point, because sometimes people ask what a ton of carbon relates to. From a physical scale point of view, a ton of carbon is roughly the same size as an inflated hot air balloon. So it's just a useful conceptual image. If somebody says they have 1,000-ton carbon footprint, then imagine 1,000 hot air balloons escaping from their organization each year. So it obviously highlighted the fact that within there you need emissions factors as part of what you're doing here. So there's obviously an obvious question there is where you get them from. The beneficial situation in the United Kingdom is the government produces a pretty wide-ranging collection of them, and there's a hyperlink there in terms of where you can get them from. That set is not complete for a full scope carbon footprint. You will be able to complete a scope 1 and 2 carbon footprint using them. And I'll just confirm what I mean by those scopes in a minute. But in terms of the things that covers, you've got the carbon factors, fuel, bioenergy, refrigerants, vehicle usage, electricity, water, waste, business travel, some construction and industrial materials, but not all of them. And there is some logistics factors in there as well. What it won't cover is the kind of what most people refer to as the scope 3 agenda in detail. It won't cover the stuff you purchase and some of the more complex areas. And those emissions data sets are generally only really available readily in paid software solutions. You can get them on a one-by-one basis from things like EcoInvent as a online platform where you can register for an account, but use those with a sense of caution in just simply from the point of view of there's an awful lot of factors in inventory databases like that. So it might become to one of those points where it's easier to access a calculator of some form. Because in that circumstance, what you'd be doing is putting in the right number with the right factor. And it's just a sense of caution to make sure that you're reading the guidance within any of the data sets of factors that you've got. Even the government one has a couple of paragraphs above each page just to make sure that you know how you're using them correctly in terms of time periods and other aspects about what is and is not in scope of that factor. So in terms of the journey you've got to follow to do this, it's quite important to understand what your organization does, almost your inputs and outputs, and then map that in terms of what that looks like as emission sources, and we'll get on to what that looks like in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3 in a moment. And that kind of second stage, as highlighted, is kind of categorize them and put them into scopes, and really that allows you to draw a boundary around your organization. What is your carbon footprint versus what is somebody else's? When you get to the scope 3 side of this, there is an element of double counting. Something that is your emission is also going to be part of somebody else's, but it's still your emission from the point of view of the fact that the idea behind scope 3 is that you can influence it. And if you have influence over it, you should take responsibility for the fact that you need to play a part in reducing it. The fact that somebody else may also have the same irrelevant piece of footprint just means you need to take joint responsibility for reducing it. And that might be intentionally joint, as in a collaborative exercise, or that may be that you're both taking individual actions which help, for example, transport systems to start changing. And it's it's that mindset that needs to be applied on the scope 3 agenda. Ultimately, once you understand what that looks like for you, you need to identify your data sources, and most of the rest of this will talk about what data sources you might use for that. And then ultimately, you're trying to calculate and report. And we'll go through the calculation bit just as a conceptual piece at the end. In terms of reporting, that can be very variant from one solution to another, but ultimately you're needing to get some understanding of scale, time series kind of understanding in terms of whether your carbon footprint is going up, down, whether there's any trend analysis in it. So I mentioned the scope element a couple of times in the previous slides. In just this specific element of the carbon footprinting is really quite important just to make sure you're clear on if you're doing this work. So there are 3 scopes. They are literally referred to as the numbers that are on here. So scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Scope 1 is anything you directly release into the atmosphere. So that's the emissions that come directly from combustion. That's fugitive emissions from what we refer to them as fugitive because they've escaped. So things that escape from refrigerant systems. And sometimes you've got industrial process emissions there as well. There might be a byproduct of an industrial process that's being released directly to the atmosphere through a stack or something. That would be accounted for there. Purchased energy is your scope 2. So that's your electricity. And then if you're purchasing any of it, steam, heat, or cooling, you wouldn't necessarily account for your own steam in that if you're generating that through a combustion process, because you'd be double counting. Because you'd have already accounted for the emission from scope 1 for the fuel you used to produce the steam if you were doing it through, say, for example, gas or oil. And then you end up with your scope 3 aspects to this, which covers the things that are upstream of you. That's the supply side before you, and then the downstream side of you. So that's depth beyond you down to the customer, to the end of life of the journey of things. And there are, again, there are things to think about in terms of the scope of different parts of that. But ultimately, if you can measure the activity, and we'll go into what you measure that activity by shortly, then you can use the carbon factors that relate to that, and you can quantify the impact of the different activities that you're undertaking. Why those scopes? Why the definitions that we've got? Ultimately, it's all driven from something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is basically the global reporting standard for 90+% of global carbon footprint. And it's a set of documentation. It's not one document. It's a collective set of them that is operated by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. The best way to navigate it is really go onto their website. There's a series of useful documents there, but the critical documents that we'd be referring to in this particular situation would be the corporate accounting standard, which is really in relation to all of what we're talking about here, but particularly scope 1 and 2. And then there is a particular document of which there's a screenshot of the 3rd document down there, which is referred to as the corporate value chain (scope 3) accounting and reporting standard, which is the document that deals specifically with that scope 3 element of what we've just spoken about. They are pretty heavy going in terms of reading. So again, you'll benefit more here potentially in terms of starting from a point of view of accessing a tool that will provide you the ability to do that, where it's really about understanding the tool, not understanding the standard, and give perspective in terms of what I'm talking about. The collective reading of them all would be hundreds of pages in terms of reading for someone. If however you're trying to get a more of a technical understanding in this area, it probably is worth investing the time. But if you're trying to just help move your organization forward and want to really focus on action rather than potentially kind of getting stuck in a kind of paralysis by analysis situation, then it would be more advisable to probably use a tool. And hence the the slide I'm now showing. So just pulling together some examples of where you can go to get solutions. So the Carbon Trust does provide a freely available calculator for SMEs, but it's limited scope. It doesn't cover more than just the travel aspects of the scope 3 side. I think it has an element of water and waste in it, but it doesn't have procurement, logistics, and other bits and pieces. And for some organizations, that can be more than half of their carbon footprint. So bear that in mind. Likewise, Carbon Expert, good platform, and it's also sometimes referred to as the Future Net Zero standard, but likewise is limited scope. The investors in environment structure works with the Smart Carbon Calculator, a good tool in terms of what's there, and that is full scope reporting. Energize, the organization of which I'm the founder, one of the co-founders and managing director of, one of our parts of our business is that net zero club that's in the top right. So just declaring my hand there, I'm slightly over highlighting my own thing, but that is also full scope as an option. And then you've got the carbonfootprint.com have their own platform as well. In everything other than the carbon trust situation, there is a monthly or quarterly or annual license fee for Smart Carbon, Net Zero Club, Carbon Expert, and carbonfootprint.com. Although on the very small end of your micro level, you may find there's a free level access on some of those. The Carbon Trust tool is free, so it's potentially a good place to start. You can also take all of the pieces that we've run through here and develop your own spreadsheet. And that's a perfectly reasonable approach to it, but the level of caution that I've just highlighted in the previous slides should not be forgotten. You're going to be a lot more confident in the results you get along that journey if you use a platform that is being validated in some way. In terms of what you're going to see as an outcome here, then I've just highlighted a completely kind of this is a real world example. It's a very, very large business, but it's helpful to explain the kind of comparative scale of impact that some organizations will see. So this is, say, a manufacturing company where traditionally it might have been seen that their environmental impact was in the gas used in the building and the electricity. And that is absolutely the case. You've still in this situation got 7,500 tons of carbon that relate to that. But what the scope 3 agenda does is highlight to you that actually that carbon footprint is only 15% of a much wider carbon footprint. And it's that understanding that scope 3 element. The vast majority of businesses will find that their carbon footprint for scope 3 is 70 to 80% of their carbon footprint. I obviously operate a services company. We're a consultancy with a software arm. Our largest, our office is our fourth most significant element of our carbon footprint, with our top 3 being the purchasing of things that those goods and services we purchase. Prior to COVID, the commuting of employees to our office, and the travel that we undertake to go and see customers, being the top 3. And it's that element of that you may have your perception out of kilter with what is real until you have done this exercise. And it's one of the most important parts of doing a carbon footprint for an organization is that it means that you know where you can actually make a material difference. So yeah, it's and a prime example just on a personal level that's quite useful for people to. So the average carbon footprint in the United Kingdom is about 12.5 tons per year for an individual. Recent research shows that the vast majority of people, the 58% of people believe that recycling is the biggest single thing they can do to reduce the carbon footprint. That will only actually reduce your carbon footprint by about 0.1 of a ton. The 3 largest single measures that could be undertaken in terms of personal carbon accounting is switch to a plant-based diet, which has its own connotations in terms of people feeling okay with that, switch to an electric vehicle, or change your boiler from being gas to being a heat pump. All 3 of those have about 2 tons as an impact in terms of somebody's own carbon footprint. So doing all 3 of them would halve your carbon footprint as an individual. Whereas recycling more, which is the perception, will actually have a relatively limited impact. They all need to be done. We've all got to get our carbon footprint to net zero, remember. But it's about understanding where you can make the difference. From a point of view of kind of getting into that data and calculation piece, I'm now going to start running through kind of what the data looks like for different aspects and just kind of break that down. So kind of quite rapidly going through different sections, but just highlighting what data you might need. And we'll start off with how you calculate that on this particular example, and I'll just jump into a final example at the end. So taking electricity and gas, invoices are pretty standardized for that. On an invoice, you'll see a kilowatt hour value somewhere on that. and it's basically that kilowatt hour figure that you need for being able to calculate from the invoice. That in this case, for this total gas and power invoice, you've got a total consumption line here that's just literally giving you the total consumption in the period. And what you would do is take the start and end date and figure out, okay, between that start and end date, I have emitted X. So if that were 1,000 kilowatt hours, same as I showed before, multiply by carbon factor, and that gives you the carbon footprint that you would be that would be reportable for that invoice. And basically, for each piece of activity, you should be able to attribute a piece of carbon against it. It gets a bit more complicated when you get to fuel. The best case scenario, you'll have something like the top left, which is that you have fuel cards. You'll have a statement of what's in that fuel card, and it will give you the liters in terms of it. So in this case, it would be the quantity column, this one here that you would take out, and that would be what you'd be using, because the most accurate way you can report travel is using fuel, because it has a kind of pretty standard burn rate, and therefore the carbon is more accurate that way. But you can also do it by mileage, and obviously records around that for some organizations are much less easy to access. You'll have written mileage books sometimes, and those are harder to transpose into being a real record for organizations. So there is sometimes quite a bit of data collection required behind this, and it's worth kind of coming up with a plan behind that. Refrigerants, basically this is about when your air conditioning systems or large refrigeration are recharged. So basically the refrigerant that is used to transfer heat in a refrigeration system sometimes leaks from the system. They sometimes have to be recharged to make them work again, or you get a new system, or various reasons why you would have a record of the refrigerant. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, I've put a blank record on the screen. That's because most people don't have these records. So this is what it would look like. Traditionally, you'd have an F-gas logbook, but you may find you don't necessarily have it. The best way to get it generally is to engage your maintenance engineer, be that internal or an external contractor, and ask them for basically how much F-gas have you, or how much recharge have you had to put of refrigerant into any of our systems in the last 12 months or so on. And they're getting increasingly used to being asked those questions. So legally, you should have an F-gas record, but that's a topic slightly separate from this particular one, and I'm going to kind of move on from that particular topic. So just jumping into the scope 3 aspect, there's lots of different ways you can break down scope 3. The GHG protocol actually breaks it down into 15 categories. For kind of conceptualizing it, I've broken it down here into 7 chunks: travel, procurement, logistics, waste, water, what's referred to as well as tank emissions, and I'll get to those in a minute, and then others. So I'm just going to jump into each of those and just talk about the kind of data that's there. This material, and obviously in terms of the contents in here, is quite self-explanatory what's on the slide, so I'm not going to run through everything on each slide, but I'm just going to talk through the kind of general feel to each one. So if we just jump into travel, what we're talking around in terms of travel is 2 key aspects: the business travel on behalf of the organization itself, and then employee commuting and remote working. So the greenhouse gas protocol and the guidance in it refers that if an employee works remotely, you should consider those emissions as a substitution for, because it's kind of taking account of the impact of the decision. We've a few months back produced a guide. It's on theenergise.com as a website about how to calculate your employee working from home emissions, particularly around the impacts of COVID, because what we're finding is quite a lot of organizations have reduced their scope 1 and 2 emissions, which gives an artificial reduction in the carbon footprint. But what it's not doing is accounting for the fact that all they've actually done is shift the emissions into the home. And so that guide basically provides how you can calculate that. So yeah, if you just if you go to the blog section of our website, there's a guide there, or you can just search the website for working from home and it will come up. In terms of travel, I'm not going to read everything that's on here, but ultimately what we're doing here, and the same structure for each of the sections, is we're talking about how you would calculate that, what information is required, what data sets you would therefore collect to do that, and then basically which is the most or least accurate in terms of an approach. In general, with travel, you want fuel if you can get it in terms of volume. if you can't, distance. If you can't, how much you spent on it. And then if you can't do that, how many people traveled, how far, or how many people traveled in general. You get various levels of how good that is. So from a point of view, what you should be looking for internally to compile that, that's fuel receipts, that's purchasing records, that's business travel documents, that's transport management systems for larger organizations, and so on. Just moving on to procurement, what we're talking about here is the things that you purchase, so goods, services, materials. So we're talking about things in construction in terms of products you purchase in that. We're talking about services, equipment rentals, security, travel, accounting, catering, whatever that is, IT, manufactured products that you purchase, furniture, as an example, food and drink, maybe raw material purchase. That list isn't exhaustive. You'll need to do an aspects and impacts assessment of your organization to figure out what it is you purchase, and therefore what needs to kind of be accounted for. There are various ways you can do this. The vast majority of organizations will realistically need to do it from the bottom, the least accurate answer here, upwards. There is a technical aspect to this one. So my strong recommendation in here would be you use what we're referring to in here as spend method. So basically you are calculating it based on how much you spend in a certain subsector of the economy. There are carbon factors available. Some of them are proprietary, but in terms of the calculation pieces I spoke about earlier, basically there's sets of analysis that understand how carbon intense each sector of the economy is. And if you spend money on accounting, it has this impact. If you spend money on catering, it has this impact, and so on. And there's a quite wide-ranging set of economic analysis that provides that carbon footprinting. So that slide is very helpful from a point of view of being able to dive into what your long-term plan might be, but really probably more than anything else, would focus on what you're spending on certain areas, and then focusing on what are the most carbon intense sectors, and whether you need to have as much of an impact there, or whether you can engage the supplier that's supplying that to you to provide you a lower carbon answer. And as part of that, the rest of the data that's on here to get a more accurate answer. Logistics is kind of an extension of what we've just spoken about, in the sense that you need to get those products and goods and materials to you. So there is an element of basically figuring out the location of origin of where that came to you, and how heavy it is, and it really is done by that distance and weight. And there aren't really that many estimation solutions here, other than the fact that if you don't have the exact location, it's perfectly legitimate to go, I know this product emanated from Italy, I know I'm in the United Kingdom, so I'm just going to calculate an average distance for everything that comes from Italy. That's perfectly reasonable, and lots of organizations do that. Don't expect that you have to calculate it down to the exact kilometer. There is a significant chunk of estimation that exists around getting this. It's about understanding where you can make a difference, rather than getting lost in whether you can get decimal point percentage accuracy improvements. Water, really here is utility bills, but you might have automated meter readings. So your least accurate would be an estimated water bill. You're then going up to manual meter readings, actual utility bills from the supplier, and then to automatic, like half hourly or hourly or daily meter readings. You need to account for wastewater and supply separately, so be careful of this when you're looking at an invoice, because the carbon factors are different for each of them, and quite a lot of invoices will show different volume come into your organization and then goes out. In that there is almost an assumption in terms of the structure, and some people have metered wastewater, and you should bear that in mind in terms of the equation as well. From a waste point of view, so we're talking about kind of all waste, including stuff that's recycled here. You need to get an understanding of the split in terms of what is going to recycling or reuse, versus what might be landfill. There are very different carbon footprints for those impacts. So the same material in one direction will be different in another. So basically, again, using the data that's on here in terms of accuracy and the approach to that. If you can't figure out quite what your waste volumes are in tons, wrap provide a calculator which you can search on their website that will estimate the weight of waste based upon the number of bins you have and what material they are. Basically, there are ways of calculating that. Well to tank, this is basically about, if you think about a vehicle as an example, the idea, if you take here, is a well to tank and then tank to wheel, is that you've got the energy that is used in the scope 3 side of the world to produce the energy or get the energy to you that you are using. So in this case, you've got to produce oil, transport it, distribute it, put it in your vehicle. Whereas if you just take account of the fuel itself, or you're taking account of the combustion, which is the kind of tank to wheel bit in this occasion. So you have to deal with the well to tank element, and there's a set of carbon factors for that. So for each piece you have in your scope 1 and 2 carbon footprint, other than refrigerants and fugitive emissions, there'll be a well to tank carbon factor that you need to take account of as well. So you're effectively needing to create a secondary record of each thing that's in your scope 1 and 2 in terms of electricity and fuels. Just finally, in terms of the final section, these are the 15 categories of the GHG protocol I was mentioning, but you need more detailed guidance specifically around topics around sold products, end of life, franchises, investments. Honestly, if you've got those kind of things that you're diving into detail, you probably should engage a consultant of some form. They are more complex topics. If you have a product as a business that is very much the majority of the emissions are in the customer's use, there are light touch ways to do this. It's not thousands and thousands of pounds for consultants. There are solutions out there. We do exactly this with some organizations where you can just get advice from somebody to help you figure out what's the solution that's suitable for your size of organization. But you do probably need to engage a specialist in some form for that, because it's quite a complex topic, and you need to undertake potentially something called a life cycle analysis assessment, and that's a different equation to a corporate carbon footprint, which is the focus of this presentation. So that's a wrap in terms of this presentation itself. I just have one other thing to show, which hopefully has come up on the screen, in terms of the just the kind of exercise of kind of having a utility bill, looking at how you can kind of estimate. So this is taking electricity as an example. So if you had that utility bill I spoke around before, and maybe this is the sum of your 12 months invoices, this is how you would go about calculating the carbon footprint. So literally, as I said before, consumption times by the carbon factor. But if you were, for example, trying to estimate that, there are solutions out there for that estimation, and taking a kind of a floor area based way of doing this, which is the most common way you do it for electricity. Say you had a 206 square meter building. The Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers operates a series of benchmarks. They're in a document referred to as TM46, Technical Memorandum 46. You can find it on their website. That contains carbon factors for each type of building in the UK. Not carbon factors, sorry, benchmarks. And you can use those as a way of estimating the gaps. What you'll also find if you use some of those proprietary tools that I highlighted is that they'll have those benchmarks built into their capabilities as an estimation technique. Ultimately, what that allows you to do, part of what I'm showing you here as an example, is that using the, so this is real data in terms of kilowatt hours from a building. By using an estimation technique, you may overestimate, you may underestimate your emissions, but that's why we talk about that accuracy piece earlier in the presentation. So that's the worked example of the conceptual piece. You're basically saying, in terms of the estimation piece, I've got the size here, kilowatt hours here per annum, that gets me to that number, multiplied by the carbon factor, carbon footprint in tons. So you just need to break down each part of your business piece by piece doing that. Generally, most people prioritize scope 1 and 2 first, and then start tackling that scope 3 agenda. Majority of people start with upstream scope 3 before they do the downstream, largely because most people have more of an upstream emission pieces. If you're a goods and materials provider, it may well be the other way around, but if you're a services-based business, and obviously the UK economy is predominantly a service-based economy, then upstream emissions are a very significant thing and should be a focus. So that's a wrap in terms of what I was going to go through today. So yeah, hopefully that's been helpful, and helps kind of to figure out how you can engage with your carbon footprint, and how you can get to grips with your the first stage of your net zero journey, and you can from that kind of map out what your priority steps are to get towards net zero.
Okay, can everybody see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, I was imagining we would do some Q&A, but in fact, there was a question, wasn't there? So shall we just answer that question first, and then I'll move on to my slides. It's a fairly easy question to answer. Nicole, will you ask the question? I can't see where the chat's gone now.
Yeah, it was a question from Sean, and he said, how do you account for when the carbon coefficient changes, e.g. electricity sourced from coal versus gas versus sustainable energy?
So if you follow the link that Simon posted, I've actually got the same link in my presentation as well, as one of the kind of things to look out for. If you follow that link, what it will take you to is a website, and you'll have a list of different years that you can choose from, and one's a kind of condensed form that will do for most organisations, and then there's a fuller form for people who maybe have more specific things. And as Simon said, some of them you won't be able to get from that list and need to be obtained from elsewhere, but for most parties that will do everything, including electricity, which I think is mostly what you are asking about. So the conversion factors obviously change year on year as our grid decarbonises, as we move less coal sources, more renewable sources, etc. So you need to have the most up-to-date year of conversion factors relating to your specific data set that you're looking at. So if you're looking, so at the moment I'm auditing 2020 data sets. So people will have perhaps a whole year of 2020 data, and they need to look at the 2020 conversion factors, and those will be up to date and will account for the UK grid mix throughout 2020 on average. So it will account for all of those different sources. If you're using a specific renewable source that you're purchasing from elsewhere, we take it that that is still grid electricity, that's still the average grid electricity, because obviously the grid average accounts for that renewable energy. So you would just count it as your average grid. I believe there's a different conversion factor if you self-generate your electricity. I would need to look that up. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but that is the circumstance when you would choose a different conversion factor. Just because you purchase renewable energy doesn't necessarily mean you get to use that different conversion factor. So hopefully that answers that question. I'm going to cover it perhaps a little bit more in just a minute. So shall I carry on with my slides, or was there any other questions?
Can I just say, Simon thinks he'll be back in 10 minutes. So if you'd like to carry on, that'd be fabulous. Thank you.
Okay. Brilliant. So what I wanted to do was give some examples of some SME carbon footprints. So these are not massive reports that these businesses are using to demonstrate compliance with things like SECA. These are carbon footprints that they have developed just to help them understand their own organisation better. They're not publicising them particularly, they're just calculating them and using them internally to better understand their organisation and where their significant impacts are. So I wanted to show you what that might look like. As Simon mentioned, you can either use an online platform. So for IIE, if we have organisations that are bigger, more complex, need to report against specific requirements, we would forward them on to, well, we have a partnership with Smart Carbon, but for a lot of our SMEs, all they need is something which is Excel based. So we've got two options. We've got an Excel based IIE carbon calculator that we can forward over to our members, or we can help our members to develop something. And that something might look a little something like this. So what this is a resources monitoring sheet. And what they've done is each of these tabs represents a different resource that they're monitoring. So I'll show you what this tab looks like. There's actually a lot more tabs than this. I've hidden a lot of the tabs. So that's what this one looks like. So this is monitoring site electricity. So you can see here, every month, they're recording their total kilowatt hours. And actually, again, I've actually hidden a lot more data than I'm showing here, because they actually monitor against the number of units they produce as well, so that they can monitor how efficiently they're working as well as their overall carbon footprint. So what they do is they pop those in there, the total figures. There's an auto sum that gives them an auto annual total at the bottom there. And then if you look at that figure there, 101420, this carbon footprint calculator at the end here will then pick up that information. So you can see it here, 101420. So if you look at each of these cells, they would each say equals to, and then refer back to one of these resources. So it pulls the information through from the resources monitoring sheet. It multiplies it up by an appropriate conversion factor. So this follows on nicely from what Simon was most recently talking about, where you've got the equation of, you've got the thing that you're using multiplied by a conversion factor. So it says here conversion factor taken from IIE carbon footprint guide, but those, the IIE carbon footprint guide would then say, well, these are taken from the government figures from BEIS, and I've got the link for that as well. Obviously Simon's already posted it as well, so that you can get those conversion factors yourself. And then if you looked at this column would just say equals to this cell multiplied by this cell and divided by 1,000 to give you the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, because as Simon said, that's the convention that it's reported in. Otherwise it's going to be quite a large number. So if you have a strangely large carbon footprint, then maybe just consider, well, is this actually in kilograms rather than tons? So that's an example of what a carbon footprint might look like if you were to develop it within your own organization. I just wanted to go through some common mistakes. So some things that I see a fair number of times when I'm auditing these carbon footprints. This is not to belittle any of my members who have presented these carbon footprints to me. This is to say these are easy mistakes to make. They happen a lot. I've seen some of them happen not only to small businesses where it's not particularly a sustainability professional in post or somebody that knows much about carbon footprinting, etc. But it also happens in larger organizations where they've got a big team and somebody's forgotten to update the conversion factors and things. So it's easily done. So the first common mistake I wanted to mention was breaking down data sufficiently. So in the example here, this is the mileage, the grey section is the mileage, but what they did was they actually lumped in all the mileage together so that we couldn't really put a nice accurate conversion figure on it. So if you look here, you can just about see a little note that says mileage assumes 50-50 petrol and diesel vehicles, because we didn't have that information at the time, so we had to do a bit of guesstimation. So I put that down as something, a recommendation for improvement for the future. You need to start figuring out exactly what vehicles are these so we can put an appropriate conversion factor on them. They also didn't differentiate between business mileage, which is scope 3, and fleet mileage, which would be a scope 1 emission. So we weren't able to differentiate between those. And the good thing about doing that is that you're then able to hone down, well, which is bigger and which will I have more impact if I try to go about reducing that particular tonnage of carbon dioxide equivalent. Some more common mistakes. This is essentially what I said when I was answering the question previously, using the correct conversion factor. So I wanted to show an example. This one I audited probably a couple of weeks ago now, so a very recent one, and we were looking at 2020 data. And the carbon footprints were submitted to me, and the person actually submitted 2 carbon footprints to me. One of them was done via the IIE Excel calculator, and one of them was done via forest carbon, a forest carbon calculator. Now, forest carbon is a partner of IIE, so I felt confident that they would know what they were doing. I also felt confident that the IIE carbon calculator was correct, yet the 2 footprints were different. So if you can see here, the IIE calculator calculated 13.68 tonnes, and the carbon forest calculator calculated 14.64. So I interrogated the data a bit more, and it looked like it was pretty much the same data. There was a bit of water in there in the IIE calculator that wasn't accounted for in the other, but the significant difference was that the conversion factors were different. And the reason the conversion factors were different was because this calculator, when I had a look around on it, I realized this is an out-of-date calculator. So what my client had done was she had received the calculator the year before, and it had 2018 conversion factors in it. And she had overwritten that and recalculated the 2020 footprint. But obviously with the decarbonising of the grid electricity, etc., it skewed the figures quite significantly. So it is important that you get the correct conversion factors. So Simon has already put the link, but I've put it again here so that you can go to that and you can see the conversion factors. Some more common mistakes, using the correct unit of measurement. So the example I'm giving here, when I first looked at this carbon footprint, the total carbon footprint was much bigger, and the proportion of paper, which at the moment is quite a small sliver, was really quite significant. I can't remember how big, but it was strangely big. And paper's usually not all that significant when you're looking at kind of scope 1 and 2 and a few scope 3 emissions. So I thought that was odd. So I had a look at it, and again, it was the wrong unit of measurement that had been entered for the conversion factor. So I think this was a footprint that I looked at over a year ago now. And I think it was that the paper should have been measured in tonnes, but they had input it as reams instead of tonnes. So we just had to work out, well, what's an appropriate conversion factor? I think they just weighed a ream of paper and then figured out what they needed to divide it up by. And then that gave us a much more realistic carbon footprint for their paper and made it a more realistic proportion of the overall carbon footprint. This is the last example I wanted to show you, and I wanted to show this one for a number of reasons. So the first one was just to show that just calculating your carbon footprint in itself is not actually going to do anything to save the environment or save the world. It's only one step. It's the analysis of your carbon footprint that is the important bit. So what we encourage our businesses to do is look at their carbon footprint over the course of the year. Obviously, we encourage our businesses to do a lot of other things as well at the same time, so that they're actively reducing their carbon footprint. And we ask them to look at their carbon footprint against last year's carbon footprint and also against a baseline that they set up when they first join IIE or when they have data for, and to see, well, what is the difference? And is what we've been doing, has that been successful? If it has, why has it? And how can we continue this? And if it hasn't, why not? And do we need to change the approach? So the analysis of this footprint, obviously this is 2019 versus 2020, and it's an office-based organisation. And as many offices have done this year, obviously this organisation had fewer people in the office, and also they did absolutely no mileage. So I don't know if you can see these figures very clearly. This is a different, there are different numbers along here, so it's a different scale, but this one's 7.55 tonnes for 2019, and then it was only 1.95 tonnes for 2020. So the learning from that would be, okay, so obviously they did a lot of less travel because they had to, because of lockdowns. But the question would be, have you been able to do business as successfully without the travel as you have with? And if the answer is yes, well, let's see this as a silver lining, and let's use teleconferencing more, webinars, etc. So that's something that a lot of our organisations are learning from this year, as I'm sure many of you have. And that's the sort of analysis that you would undertake for your carbon footprint, to work out, you know, well, what can we change? What can we do better? The other thing I wanted to point out with this one is that obviously, for a lot of organisations where they've got staff working from home, this isn't a true reflection of the overall carbon footprint, because just because they're not in the office doesn't mean that that particular impact of them working on their laptop, etc., has disappeared. So there's a real shift of emissions over the last year, with more people working from home. So at IIE, we've developed a calculator for estimating working from home emissions, and that's based on this home working emissions white paper, which was published last year. And again, I've put the link here so that people can have a look at it and have a read of that if you're interested. And if you do want more support calculating your carbon footprint, and I would encourage people to try and reach out and perhaps obtain more support, certainly for that first carbon footprint, because if you can feel confident that you've got the first one right, you can do a bit of gut instinct analysis the second year, third year, etc., of saying, well, if my carbon footprint last year was smaller than my carbon footprint this year, and all my resources have gone down, then perhaps something's gone wrong somewhere along the line. So if you do want more support, IIE membership includes support in calculating your carbon footprint in whatever way is best for you. That might be the IIE carbon calculator, that might be adding something to your resources monitoring sheet, that might be accessing the Smart Carbon platform. We also offer various training. There's also organisations like Forest Carbon that will offset your carbon footprint if that's of interest. And then obviously Energize has their own offering, which I presume Simon will talk you through. And then there's plenty of other organisations out there who will be available and willing to support you calculating your carbon footprint. So that was my presentation. Should we have some questions? And then hopefully Simon might be able to restart his presentation. Are there any questions?
Yeah. So Simon does hope to come back in a few minutes. There was a question from Roger, and Claire, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but if somebody does, just unmute yourself and answer if Claire doesn't. It says, has anyone got a source of good data on the embodied energy and carbon in PV systems? Not just the panels and supports, but the inverter, the charger, the battery, the entire electronic control system.
I'm sure the information is available somewhere. I wouldn't know off the top of my head where all that information would be. It might be that Simon has the answer to that, but yeah, by all means, if anybody knows the answer to that,
Chris has put a link in the chat for the answer to that, Roger. Okay. Great, thank you. Any other questions?
We could also have a discussion about data gathering if people would like to, if anybody has any questions about data gathering, if they had difficulty or a question cropped up.
Oh, my video's not working.
We can still hear you.
Just stay on audio, Elizabeth.
Right. Under common mistakes, A, I couldn't hear what you said. You added all the mileage together and it didn't differentiate between street mileage and something else. Now, because I'm getting old, I guess I didn't hear what you said.
So it didn't differentiate in several different ways. So it was this slide. So break the mileage down very well. So they didn't differentiate between fleet mileage.
Ah,
so that is
the firm's cars
owned by the company and driven by employees versus business. So that would be considered scope 1 emissions, and they didn't differentiate between that and business mileage. So that is vehicles which were owned by employees, driven by the employee, and then obviously they reclaim mileage for driving that vehicle, which is considered a scope 3 emission.
Thank you very much. I shall turn this off because I'm coughing.
Okay, there was a question from Katie, and it was, do emissions from staff commutes count as scope 1 or scope 3 emissions?
I think you just answered that in your last answer.
Was it last one?
Scope 3, it would be scope 3, yeah.
Thanks.
We had business mileage where I worked, but then it was assumed that people getting to work, that was their problem. Is that not the case now?
Yeah, I mean, you would be able to define the scope of what your carbon foot does and doesn't include. So for IIE members, we usually focus on scope 1 and 2 emissions, those more kind of direct emissions associated with the business, and then we would also encourage members to start including more and more of their scope 3 emissions. So commonly our members would include things like business mileage, but they might not include commuting, and it might be that several years down the line, once they've sort of grown and grown and grown their calculation and refined it and got it better every year, it might be that at some point they start including their commuting. But the focus generally is always going to be what the business has the most direct control over, and also from a business perspective, it generally makes more sense to focus on something which is going to save the business money. So obviously commuting costs are not going to save the business money, whereas reducing business mileage will save the business money. So yeah, there are other benefits to reducing commuter mileage, like having people working from home reduces the general overheads and perhaps means that businesses can reduce the size of their offices, etc. But yeah, anyway, okay. That probably answers it more than you were after.
Thank you.
Thank you. A question on Richard Hales from Addenbrooke's it says, is green tariff for electricity worth the additional cost? Do we know if it really means more investment in greening the grid?
It's a good question. We did have we actually have a event about this. We had somebody from Ecotricity talking about it, and my sort of gut feeling is it depends on the provider. You know, for Ecotricity, I feel that yes, it would be worth it because they are quite actively working to increase renewable projects, but perhaps other organisations, it might just be a bit of greenwash, to be honest. So I think you need to proceed with caution, would be my feeling about that.
Any more questions? Claire. So, okay. Oh, I don't think that's a question. It's from Roger. Okay.
There was a question about whether we're going to share slides, and yes, we're going to send out the slides and the chat and the presentations, etc., the recording after the event.
Okay, so Simon says he's back in a minute. So there's a question from Nicola. What about how to deal with waste disposal? With waste disposal?
So there's specific conversion factors relating to waste disposal. So you would need to measure your waste in tons and then use an appropriate conversion factor. And I'm pretty sure that you can get, there's different conversion factors. So if it's general waste, or if it's going for incineration, or if it's recycling, etc., you would choose different conversion factors depending on exactly what type of waste it is and how it's being disposed of.
Thanks, Claire. There's another question from Kyra Robb asked, is it easy to marry bills / emissions with calendar years?
Sorry, this is actually something I meant to say and I didn't say. So you don't always have to have an exact precise calendar year. So what you would do, if you can't get an entire calendar year, a lot of our members don't monitor an exact calendar year. A lot of our members monitor based on financial year. Some just monitor based on whenever they joined IIE or started thinking about monitoring their resources. So they might have information that goes from April to March. So what would you do? What you would do in that case is you would just say, well, which year is most of my data in, and you would choose the year that you have most of the data in. So you do not need to marry up the data with exact calendar years.
Any other questions?
This is quite complicated. It's an old church. There are 2 gas meters and 2 electric meters. And so I have the totals for 2017 and 2018 for each. And I have the square meterage. And we then went into construction to hopefully change, all the lights to LEDs and lots of insulation and lots of secondary glazing and things like that. So do you want me to try and give raw figures here, or just
No, I think the idea was
what we need to do now is set up the structure so that we get comparable figures. So we've added a mezzanine, so there's more floor area, and hopefully the figures will be low. But we were not able to get a heat pump, which is a total disappointment. But so we still got lots of gas usage.
So in terms of, you've obviously got the data, and in terms of figuring out, sort of proportioning it out to account for the extra floor space. So the way we would do that within IIE is we have a nice calculator that kind of automatically accounts for extra floor space or extra employees, and then sort of proportions it all out, like I say, so that it would just be a question of essentially saying, right, by what proportion has the floor area expanded, and then working out okay, so how much has the carbon footprint increased, and then working out, okay, what's attributed. So essentially you would be dividing by floor area to work out a carbon footprint per meter squared, is how we would
that I think it's quite a big step for a charity to get. We happen to have sold another building, so we had a fair amount of budget, and so we didn't actually have decent plans of anything. So we got in surveyors to do a measured survey. So we knew exactly how many square meters. And then I managed, it took me months to get all the bills for all the different ones. And we had a caretaker's flat as well. And so that's gone into the mix because the caretaker's flat is now somewhere else in the building and the square meters are different. But so we're not actually into the building yet because of COVID. We're literally just handed over last week, or I guess a week ago, 2 weeks ago. So we're just going to start collecting for a year. I mean, we won't know anything about how it's performing now for a year.
Yeah, absolutely. You're always auditing. Well, for us, we're always auditing and comparing data a year behind, because you want to have that good spread of data, because obviously, and I know Margaret knows this because I know Margaret, and Margaret's a very experienced architect, but for everyone else's benefit, obviously you need the full year of data to account for seasonal variances. So, you know, colder winter, hotter in the summer, lighter in the summer, darker in the winter, etc., etc.
What I say to householders is it's really better to have 2 years, because, you know, I can see the beast from the east on these bills. That's how incredibly critical that was, because the cost was huge for that week. You know, you're not looking at costs, but anyway, we were also able to go to the Church of England sustainability drive, where they did a huge audit of a lot of churches and a lot of halls, and they classed them as medium, small, medium, and large. And so we were able to sort of target a medium one and see how we compared to their benchmark.
Yeah.
And I was able to say, again, you've got to take, in a charity, you've got to take all the people with you. You can't just sort of say, well, we need this. So I was able to say that our halls used 80% more than the Church of England benchmark for the same size hall, which was hideous. And the church itself used more than double the sorry, I'm not going to be able to answer that. Right. Okay, that's done. So that was quite a useful tool. I don't think most people understood what I was talking about, but it sounded bad.
Yeah, definitely. And that sort of benchmarking information is available for a lot of different sectors. So, you know, for the different organisations attending now, you should be able to get that sort of information.
Is there a central source for that kind of benchmarking?
Well, I know there used to be all that information used to be, I'm trying to think what the organisation was. It wasn't RAP, it was EnviroWise used to have a lot of information. I think they're no longer going, and I'm not sure who it would be now, but I'm sure it's out there somewhere.
Well, that would be a really useful thing for people to get benchmarks, because this was pretty crude. It was simply the area on the measured survey and the bills. There was no correcting for degree days or anything else. And we didn't look at scope 2, scope 3. It was just raw. Yeah. But at least it's a basis for comparison once we finish the renovation.
Yeah. And I think your point about needing more than 1 year of data is important, and particularly in light of the fact that, you know, 2020 was such an unusual year for so many businesses. So for a lot of the businesses that we're working with on IIE, that's why it's important that we have some kind of baseline year, which is a more representative year. So for a lot of our businesses, when they're looking at probably 2022 data now, we will probably be comparing it more to 2019 data than the previous 2 years, because it's just been so unusual. And I imagine probably a lot of businesses will need to re-baseline in 2022. Penny Jack has got his hand up.
Okay.
Oh, you're muted.
Penny, do you want to unmute? Yeah, not Penny.
Yeah, I'm not Penny, as you can see. I did send you a question direct to Clare, which I said I'm attending as a parish councillor in a Cambridge parish, and we're hoping to reduce our carbon footprint as a village. But collecting all these statistics becomes really impossible. And I'm wondering if you have any guidance as to how we can set out and move forward in this particular realm and problem.
So you're not able to, so it's the village in terms of the houses or the buildings?
Well, as a village, we're being encouraged to sort of join in the carbon reduction game, and are looking for clues as to how to measure the carbon that we use in the village. I mean, we're 400 and something, 500 houses, 700 people. So far, you've been talking about very organized entities, SMEs and the like, where they get an individual bills for water, for electric, for gas, and so on. We're in a much more nebulous position, but want to see how we can go forward.
Okay, so my suggestion in your specific scenario would be a combination of things, really. So in terms of the houses, I would try to get as many of those households as possible to go on to CCF's Carbon Charter website and calculate their household carbon footprint. And then perhaps from there, even if all of them don't go on there and develop their carbon footprints, you can gain a bit of an estimate for households of different types, perhaps in that area. So you can work out in terms of households what sort of the carbon footprint might look like. And then I would look at the other individual buildings, and I would be looking at developing a carbon footprint, which is more along the sort of technique that we've discussed today, where you do look more specifically, if possible, at actual build data. And there's ways and means of estimating if there isn't any build data, but I think I would need to talk about that with you
as a separate thing.
Separately, because we would need to go into a lot more detail.
Okay, thank you.
Kirsten says that she has done a footprint for the parish council itself to start with, and she'd be very happy to share that with you.
There we go.
Could you repeat that?
Sorry, it's Kirsten says that she will share the details of how they calculated the footprint for the parish councils itself. I don't know which one. Gamlinge.
Oh, right. We're not far away. Yes, we're born. Gamlinge. Okay, we'll be in touch.
Wonderful. Shall I wrap up?
Yeah.
I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so the last few slides, I just wanted to reiterate something which I already mentioned, which is just that carbon footprinting alone is not going to make a huge difference to making your business, organisation, parish, whatever it is, more environmentally friendly, reducing impact, etc. It needs to be part of a wider sort of plan to systematically reduce your carbon footprint. So that analysis and working out, well, what are we going to do to reduce that? So with that in mind, the next sessions for the Ambition to Action series are going to be about setting targets and monitoring progress, and working out what can you actually do to, now you've got your carbon footprint, how can you actually start to reduce that? And maybe looking more broadly than carbon footprinting as well. Carbon footprinting doesn't always account for everything. So looking at things outside of the carbon footprint as well. So the next two sessions will be bi-weekly over the course of the next month. So the next one will be Tuesday, 25th of May, same timings, 1:30 till 3. We've got Warren Pope, who I think is on the call today somewhere, and Jane Varley, who are two experienced speakers, and I will be hosting again. And then the last session, the final session, will be about communication and engagement. And that will be both about communicating internally within your organisation, getting staff on board, persuading people to change, and that will also be looking at senior management as well as you know, people on the ground actually doing the things that make your company your company. And then also, as well as the internal communication, we'll also be talking about external communication, so talking about how you can publicize your achievements, talk about your commitments, etc., and hopefully get some of the benefits of doing these different things. So I think a lot of you are signed up already. Please do sign up if you're not. And last but not least, I just want to say a big thank you to everybody that came along. Please do go away and speak to your teams and managers about the opportunity to sign up to the charter. Contact the speakers, myself or Simon, if you would like specific professional advice about carbon footprinting. And otherwise, think about signing up to CCF's newsletter. Maybe you might want to consider volunteering with CCF or making a donation via their website. And just to reiterate, we will be sharing the recording, the slides and the chat after the event. There's lots more information on the IIE website. We do also have 2 carbon footprinting webinars available on our YouTube channel for free. So you might want to have a look at those. And feel free to get in touch with me. I've left my email address on there if you would like any information about carbon footprinting. And thank you to CCF and Nicole for organising. Thank you very, very much to Simon. We're sorry, obviously, that Simon wasn't feeling very well today, but thank you to Simon for coming along and giving it your best shot, even though you weren't feeling well. And I think that's everything. I think we will wrap it up a little bit early.